Hey everyone, ready to dive into something that impacts, well, pretty much everyone. Data centers. Those digital engines that power, well, everything these days.
That's right. And today, we're zeroing in on a critical piece of the data center puzzle, costs.
Because let's face it, nobody likes overpaying, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the tech driving our digital world. And that's where this whole idea of TCO comes in, total cost of ownership.
Exactly. We're talking about going beyond that initial sticker price. You got to think long term.
It's kind of like, you see a shiny new gadget and you're like, ooh, that's a steal.
Right. But then you realize it guzzles batteries like nobody's business. Suddenly, that bargain isn't so appealing.
Exactly. So when we talk about data storage, what are some of those hidden costs people might not even consider when they just see that initial price tag?
Oh man, where do I even start? You've got the energy it takes to run those servers 24/7, keeping them from overheating.
Because nobody wants a molten server farm,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. And then there's maintenance, repairs, even how much it costs to dispose of that hardware responsibly at the end of its life. All those things add up.
It's like thinking you scored a cheap flight, then bam, hidden fees hit you left and right, baggage fees, seat selection. Suddenly, that deal isn't looking so hot.
It's the same idea with data storage. A seemingly good deal up front could actually cost you way more over time if you don't consider those hidden costs.
Okay, so how do we make sense of this? Like, how do we compare costs fairly when we're talking about different storage options?
That is the question, right? And that's where we get into this concept called normalization. Essentially, it's about using a common unit to make apples-to-apples comparisons.
So instead of comparing like a tiny thumb drive to a massive server rack.
Exactly. In this case, the unit we use is dollar per terabyte effective per month per rack.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Hold on, back up. Terabytes effective. Break that down for me a little. Sure thing. A terabyte's basically a measure of storage space. Think of it like how much data your hard drive can hold. The effective part takes into account things like data compression.
Oh, so kind of like zipping a file to make it smaller.
Precisely. So this dollar per terabyte effective thing, it helps us see how much each terabyte of usable storage actually costs you each month for a rack of servers.
Okay, now that makes sense. It levels the playing field so we can compare costs across different storage types.
Exactly. And that brings us to these high-density QLC SSDs everyone's talking about. They've been generating a lot of buzz as a potential game changer in the data center world, but
But the million-dollar question, are they actually cost competitive compared to those old, reliable hard disk drives, the HDDs? Especially because we know data centers need massive amounts of storage, and costs can really balloon.
right, there was a lot of skepticism initially. After all, SSDs have historically been pricier upfront than HDDs.
Okay, so what did your analysis uncover? Give us the juicy details.
We went head-to-head comparing high-density QLC SSDs with HDDs. And get this, even though the SSDs had 4 times the initial cost.
4 times.
Ouch. Yeah, it's a big difference. And to make things even more challenging, they had 5 times the storage density. But here's the real shocker.
Don't leave me hanging.
Despite the higher upfront cost and density, the SSDs still came out on top.
Wait, seriously? How is that even possible with such a huge price difference up front?
Because TCO is about playing the long game. We factored in all those hidden costs, energy, maintenance, lifespan, and the SSDs actually showed a 25% TCO advantage over the HDDs.
So you're telling me these pricier, higher capacity SSDs could actually be cheaper in the long run? That totally flips the script on the idea that lower upfront cost equals lower TCO.
It sure does. It all comes back to looking at the whole picture, the entire lifespan of that hardware, to understand the true cost.
Okay, so it's not just about that initial purchase. It's about how these drives perform over time, right? What else is contributing to this cost advantage for SSDs?
You hit the nail on the head. Our analysis dug into other factors that can really impact TCO, things like replacement cycle, capacity utilization, and this thing called inline data compression. Each one of these can make a huge difference.
All right, let's break those down for our listeners. First up, replacement cycle. Are we saying SSDs last longer than HDDs? Is that even a thing?
It is. SSDs don't have any moving parts, unlike HDDs, which are basically tiny spinning disks. That alone makes SSDs way more durable, less likely to fail.
So they're like the Energizer Bunny of storage. They just keep going and going.
Exactly. Longer lifespan means fewer replacements, right? That saves money on new hardware, shipping costs, not to mention the time and effort involved in swapping out those drives. Over time, that adds up to some big savings.
Makes total sense. And what about this whole capacity utilization thing? How does that play into the cost equation?
Okay, so imagine your data center is like a library, right? Capacity utilization is all about making sure those library shelves are used efficiently. No half-empty shelves.
So we're talking about packing those terabytes like a pro Tetris player.
You got it. Higher capacity utilization means you can store more data with fewer physical drives. That translates to a lower initial investment, smaller energy bills because you're running fewer drives, and even reduced cooling costs.
Wow, efficient storage really is a beautiful thing. Okay, now for the million-dollar question. What in the world is inline data compression? Kind of sounds like magic, to be honest.
It's not magic, but it's pretty darn close. Think of it this way. You have a huge file you need to email. What do?
Zip it up.
Exactly. So inline data compression is essentially like zipping up your data on the fly as it's being stored. That means you can fit way more information into the same physical space. Again, fewer drives, lower costs, and a happier, more efficient data center.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. We're talking about some pretty significant potential TCO improvements, right? Your analysis mentioned improvements exceeding 80% in some cases. Is that even realistic?
I know, right? It almost sounds too good to be true. But those numbers are based on real data and analysis. When you bring all these factors together, longer lifespan, efficient use of space, and data compression, those savings start to multiply, and you get these amazing results.
It's like a perfect storm of cost savings. So we've established that QLC SSDs can be incredibly cost-effective, even with that higher upfront cost. But what does the future hold for these storage superheroes? Will they keep on this cost-cutting trajectory?
That's the really exciting part. Our projections show that the cost of these high-density QLC SSDs will actually continue to decrease in the coming years, making them even more competitive with HDDs.
So are we talking about a changing of the guard in the data center? Are HDDs on their way out?
Well, HDDs definitely still have their place, especially when it comes to storing data that's not accessed very often, like archives. But the TCO advantage of these QLC SSDs, it's becoming harder and harder to ignore, especially as their cost keeps going down. And it's not just about cost either. There are some environmental benefits to consider too.
Now you're speaking my language. Saving money and saving the planet. Tell me more.
Right. Because SSDs use less power and last longer, they have a much smaller carbon footprint compared to HDDs. Fewer drives in those data centers mean less energy being used, less heat generated, and less electronic waste when it's finally time to recycle them.
That's incredible. So making the switch to SSDs could be a win-win for businesses, good for their bottom line and good for the environment. It's like, trading in your gas-guzzling car for that sleek electric model, right?
Yeah.
Not only are you saving money at the pump, but you're also doing your part for the planet. It's a win-win.
Exactly. And that's why we always say, look at the bigger picture when making these tech decisions. It's not just about that initial price tag. It's about the long-term impact on your budget and, yeah, the environment too.
So for our listeners out there who might be feeling a little lost in the weeds, trying to navigate the often complicated world of data centers and storage costs, what's the key takeaway? What should they be thinking about?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Don't get hung up on that initial price. Do your homework right. Figure out what your specific needs are. Really analyze those total cost of ownership numbers over the entire life of that hardware. And don't forget about those hidden costs we talked about.
It's like, buying a house. You wouldn't just look at the listing price and jump in, right? You'd think about property taxes, potential repairs down the road. You got to factor in the whole picture.
That's a great analogy. And just like with buying a house, it's always a good idea to consult with the experts. Talk to your tech team, do your research, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
This has been an awesome deep dive into the world of data center costs. Really appreciate you breaking it all down for us. Any final words of wisdom before we wrap things up?
The tech world moves fast. What's considered best practice today might be outdated tomorrow. So stay curious, stay informed, and always be willing to challenge those assumptions. You might be surprised at what you discover.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. We've seen how these high-density QLC SSDs are shaking things up in the data center world. What other tech givens are ripe for a fresh perspective, a new way of thinking? Until next time, happy optimizing, everyone.